Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Nargis Kasyanova, and I'm a senior fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, running its program on Central Asia. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on Russia, on the economic and social impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on Central Asia. The collective West has imposed major sanctions on Russia. Moreover, the Russian economy has become toxic for many businesses, and we see them pulling out in big numbers. No matter what officials in Moscow say, trying to put on a brave face, the situation is dire, and it can be dire for Central Asian countries, given multiple linkages and dependencies that we have. So that's what we'll discuss today. The event is co-hosted by the Davis Center and our partner, the Oxo Society for Central Asian Affairs. And I will co-moderate it with my dear colleague, Bradley Jardine, the research director at the Oxo Society, who has been following the developments very closely himself, and exactly a week ago published an article titled "Russia's War in Ukraine Spells Disaster for Neighboring Central Asia" in Time Journal. And we have a great panel with us. Let me introduce them in the order I'll ask them to speak. We'll start with Maximilian Hess, who is a Central Asia Fellow in the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's a consultant based in London and researcher on questions of sovereignty, government finance, and geopolitics. He's the former head of political risk at Hawthorne Advisors and former head of research and intelligence at ECI International. I think we all follow Maximilian's articles, his writings, Eurasian.net and other sources, for which I'm personally very, very grateful. Then we'll turn to Sobor Kurbanov, who is a program officer at the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE, where he coordinates and develops programs to advance private sector-led advocacy, good governance norms, and facilitates cross-regional collaboration in Central Asia. Prior to his role at CIPE, he worked as a national program officer, economist, and governance advisor with various Central Asia donor aid agencies, Swiss SECO, UK DFID, IMF. He was also country officer at the World Bank in Tajikistan, and later a consultant at World Bank headquarters in Washington, DC, where he worked with the public and private sector in Eurasia and Tajikistan on topics such as corporate and public sector governance, competition policies, investment climate reform, macroeconomic policy dialogue, and budget transparency. Last but not least, we'll go to Dr. Kara Schenk, who is an associate professor of political science at Nazarbayev University, with teaching and research expertise in the politics of immigration and national identity in Eurasia. Her new book, published with the University of Toronto Press, is called "Why Control Immigration? Strategic Uses of Migration Management in Russia." Professor Schenk's research has looked at federal versus regional level management of migration in Russia, government and civil society responses to migration, migration agencies and rights related to corruption and informal practices, labor migration in the framework of the Eurasian Economic Union, and how migration control demonstrates state capacity. So without further ado, let me go to our speakers, and let's start with you, Max. Max, what's the situation? What's the general situation, and what impact we see already? What consequences you envision?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And I will start with giving a relatively high-level overview of the various Central Asian countries, their responses so far, and some of the key issues. One key issue that we see in all of them is a flight of dollars, sometimes towards these economies in an attempt to effectively circumvent Russia's capital controls. But really, we see major policy reactions from the central banks of all of the governments in however quite varied ways. So in Kazakhstan, we've seen a significant increase in the baseline interest rate, and we've also seen a rather interesting effective backdoor increase to the interest rate with a guarantee of an additional 10% return on domestic deposits tax-free by the end of the year. This is a kind of novel effort, kind of taking a leaf out of Turkey's own book without going quite as far and effectively offering a government hedge, but it will at the end of the day cost the government a significant amount of money. The other issue that we're seeing with these actions across the region are real changes in the exchange rates, both between these currencies that the Central Asian countries have and Russia, as well as against the US dollar, although the level of variance in all of the countries is quite significant. None of the currencies, however, had weakened as much as the ruble, at least as of earlier this week. This has the effect of lowering the value of remittances sent from Russia in dollar terms. That will have a particular impact on Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, which are the three largest sources of migrant labor in Russia. And although it is systemically most important in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where it makes up the largest share of the forex reserves and a substantial percentage of the young population's employment as well, Uzbekistan has the sheer largest number of migrants, according to research from our colleagues at the Caucasus Center. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan both will face some difficulties as a result of this in terms of managing their government finances. So far, however, I still think it is going to be manageable. Kazakhstan has substantial sovereign reserves, two wealth funds, both with around 65 billion. But of course, one of those is undergoing major political changes right now, given that it was effectively run by the Nazarbayev family. So it sort of remains to be seen how much of that fund is really available in terms of a crisis situation. We do actually know from other lawsuits against the Kazakh government, however, that it has billions, over 20 billion liquid with BNY Mellon in the United States from the other wealth fund. So I do expect they'll be able to have the potential to respond there. Geopolitically, Kazakhstan will have impacts as well, and that Russia can pressure it if it doesn't take all of the action it wants, not only because Tokayev is now essentially beholden to the Putin regime as a result of the January events, but historically, we've also seen Russia willing to exercise pressure on Kazakhstan through oil export routes as well. Uzbekistan has a fairly healthy government balance sheet, just like Kazakhstan, but it has substantially increased its reserves in recent years. Increased its debts in recent years as opposed to its reserves as part of President Shavkat Mirziyoyev's market entry efforts. I think the markets will actually remain fairly positive towards Uzbekistan. But as we said, those impacts from remittances will be quite significant. We will also see direct impacts on businesses. Of course, Alisher Usmanov, a prominent Russian Uzbek oligarch, has now been sanctioned and is known to have very close personal and even familial ties with Mirziyoyev that he's used to invest substantially in the economy there over recent years, and a lot of that will be impacted as well. So I do think we'll see a real headline growth impact in Uzbekistan. Then moving on to Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, those countries are really the most likely to be impacted, in part because Kyrgyzstan is presently rather unwilling to also seek more aid from China or more loans. Tajikistan has an unsustainable debt load and a euro bond issued in 2017 at the height of sort of the frothiness of that market due in 2027 that it cannot repay. And will be unable to repay unless it is able to issue a new note. This comes as Tajikistan is also beginning to pursue its own presidential transition, or at least indications of that are quite strong from President Emomali Rahmon, likely to his son, although the rest of his family holds substantial positions of power as well. Tajikistan does have the potential for other assets to earn foreign exchange reserves, most prominently Talco, its aluminum company, that could benefit, but this is of course controlled by the Rahmon family, and almost all of its forex earnings get disappeared into the Caymans rather than going to benefit the Tajik budget or its people. Finally, there's Turkmenistan, which is actually the least directly impacted in terms of immediate economic impact by the crisis in Russia, simply because it sells very little gas to Russia, and in fact, for a number of years didn't. Of course, 10, 15 years ago, it sold almost all of its gas to Russia, and China has really displaced it there. There's a story that's really not getting a lot of attention, but of course, there has been a presidential transition just this past weekend from President Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov to his son, Serdar. Serdar gave a statement in English on the back of the election. The number of votes he received was just under 80%, less than his father had received, and they put forward a number of candidates that to me are the classic indicators of a strong man regime in the former Soviet space looking to at least play nice with the West. But really, China is the only one who can go and provide the aid there. And that's one of the questions that we'll see over the long term. If Russia has to really reorient its gas exports towards China, then Turkmenistan will most likely lose out. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan will also lose out because the hoped for plans of the Line D construction, the new China Central Asia gas pipeline that would go through those two countries for the first time, that the Turkmen government has been talking about again in the last few months, would likely be kiboshed as well. Once again, that plan has been on hold for a number of years. So, that's sort of a high level picture, but I have to say that a lot of uncertainty really remains. No economy has been cut off as rapidly as Russia's has, especially not an economy of its kind from the global financial system. We're seeing lots of, sort of impacts from Russian buying habits already, including shortages of medicines in Central Asia that are reportedly being shipped to Moscow now. So, the full extent of the crisis remains to be seen. I do expect that it will continue to ripple through, and I am particularly bleak on the prospects for the Russian economy. And I see Russia in many ways as moving away from a market economy, and how that impacts its oligarchs, many of whom are cross-invested in Kazakhstan and some other parts of Central Asia, will have real impacts not only on the economy, but on the political economy of the region as well. And with that, I'll hand over to the next speaker, and thank you so much, and happy to take any questions later.
Thank you so much. One quick right away question. What are the prospects of the Eurasian Economic Union? Is it dead or?
Well, the Eurasian Economic Union has often been, it is more on paper than it is in reality. It has failed to effectively create a single market, and significant tariff barriers remain. There were some, in my view, quite concerning calls at the beginning of this crisis from some otherwise informed individuals calling for sanctions on Eurasian Union members. Such as Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, effectively preemptively. I wrote a piece arguing that that would not be effective because the EAU didn't really make sense as a backdoor. But, it really only comes down to one person, Vladimir Putin, where he sees that going. There have been rumors and some action on the CSTO in Russia as well, with the legislation to appoint a coordinating member coming in. Rumors in Kazakhstan about Russia seeking to drag Kazakhstan in are quite large. But in terms of its expansion, I think it's likely dead now. Uzbekistan joined as an observer member, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now. And now with the statement that we saw from the Uzbek legislature today, reaffirming its support for Ukrainian territorial integrity, also in the back of Russia's intervention in Kazakhstan under the CSTO, I think they'll be quite happy. They didn't join, but really, ultimately it comes down to one man, Putin. And I think, anybody who thinks they have a good read on exactly what he's thinking is probably a little ambitious.
Thank you very much. Let's go to you, Sober. What's your take on the situation? What are the micro and macroeconomic risks?
Thank you, Nargis, and thank you for Harvard Davis Center for organizing this very timely, important event. And when we just started this meeting, I was telling that if there is one region in the world which is going to be hit seriously and severely by this Russian sanctions, it's probably Central Asia. So from what we know now, Russia is being kind of affected by around 6,400 sanctions, and that's the highest number of sanctions in the world. So the only country which has been affected by this country, that even lower number of sanctions, is probably Iran. So, let me give a kind of more comprehensive picture. So I would like to cover 5 things. First of all, the context of this risk exposure and why this is especially severe for Central Asia. Then I would like to talk about the negative effects, the limitations of the responses in the government hands, some interesting observations so far, and the key recommendation. So let me start with the context. We need to realize that the Central Asian countries for the last 30 years have done very little to kind of develop their own model of economic growth and regional integration into the global systems. The countries remain seriously interlinked and intertwined with the Russian economy in terms of political, economic, and security cooperation. Central Asian countries getting around 40% of critical imports from Russia, including food, energy, machinery, construction materials. Some countries of the region, they're members of the Eurasian Economic Union. That's regional trade agreement, which sort of encourages internal supply chains, manufacturing, trade economic activities, and sort of protects these countries from the rest of the world for good reasons. But in the current situation, it's probably not so good. So, the Central Russia is a key destination for export of labor force and the import of critical imports from Russia. And let us not to remember that the economies of Central Asia are not so healthy at the moment after the COVID shocks. So the reserves and the economic situation is pretty much depleted in Central Asia already. So how the risks are currently materializing. Let us see that. I think it is important to make this distinction. Any shocks in Russia affecting Central Asia, and it's not something new. It happened in the past. It happened during the previous crisis of 2008, 2009, 2014, when the first series of sanctions were imposed on Russia. But this time, everything is different. First of all, it is not only just kind of macroeconomic shocks in Russia, which is happening all of a sudden for internal, external reason, and obviously affecting Central Asia. This is the comprehensive a new world order, and the effects would be long-term, hard to predict, not temporary anymore, and much more severe in terms of magnitude. So the classic, the macroeconomists having this nice buzzword, kind of macroeconomic transmission mechanism. So whenever the sanctioned economies, such as Russia, being affected by that kind of sanctions, causing the shocks and kind of contraction of production, financial sector disruptions, any country which relates and it depends on that country, such as Central Asia, is being almost immediately affected by the spillover negative trickle-down effect. So, for example, what we observe now that the critical supply and manufacturing chains in Russia being affected. There is a shortage of critical goods, energy, sugar, wheat, grain. Russia imposing temporary ban on the export of grain, which is very critical for the food security in Central Asia. There is also a contraction in the labor markets and the devaluation of ruble, which immediately translates in the reduction of remittances. And the World Bank already forecasted that Central Asia would get at least 33% less remittances this year compared to the previous years. And on the top of the kind of macroeconomic shock which we are seeing now in Russia, there's also severe disruptions of the financial markets and the supply chains. And this is especially sensitive for the member of Eurasian Economic Union, such as Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The importers, exporters, private sector companies cannot receive the cargoes and shipments which they already paid. And there's also kind of transportation being disruption which goes through Russia and Central Asia hasn't yet developed kind of alternative routes for trade and supply chains. The shortages are going to accumulate because the businesses, they're still using the existing sort of stocks, both in Russia and Central Asia, but the stocks are being depleted quickly on the top of the panicking and the kind of increased demand and the devaluation of rubles. So the prices are higher, probably on an average 5 to 20% for every various categories of goods, especially for the critical basic food items, and that is very sensitive for Central Asia. With the devaluation of ruble, so there's a kind of double impact, obviously. Yeah, the budgets, revenues, debt servicing are going to be hit. Everything else as well, the reserves are being depleted, they're not that much anyway. So, and there is no kind of eyesight in the end of this kind of nightmare. The previous kind of strategy for Central Asian countries was kind of sit and wait. kind of adopt some sort of tightening measures, limit the spending, kind of increase interest rates, and wait until the situation improves and back to normal. So the remittances and migrants could go to Russia, remittances could resume. This time is not going to happen. So the key question is what to do, and the kind of I would like to. And in this regard, I would like to see how Central Asian countries are responding to the crisis. So whenever there is that kind of crisis hitting Central Asia, the governments usually are very quick in kind of bringing together the economic team of the finance, central banks, economy ministries, and developing a nice and beautiful action plans. It is happening the same way currently as well. All Central Asian countries, they in the process of adopting and passing the sort of anti-crisis response plan. But the plans are very aspirational and they're very vague in the nature. So I would like to quote one of the measures or one of the countries' anti-crisis action plan, implement effective policies to maintain macroeconomic stability, or take necessary steps to diversify investments. The question is not what, the question is how. So basically, what I'm saying that the reforms imitation and the imitation of measures will not work this time. There is a need for very strong collective action and the policy dialogue with the businesses, with all stakeholders in the government, to radically rethink the economic model, which depends on the Russia growth, remittances, and any other external sources of growth, and develop and implement a generally kind of open and transparent, the free democratic economic policy, which would help Central Asian countries to see new kind of avenues and prospects of development in less reliance on Russia. There's a couple of interesting implications, observations so far. As previous speaker also already mentioned, anecdotally, we are seeing that we're hearing from our partners in Central Asian businesses and experts that there is a potentially influx of Russian capital assets and investments to Central Asia, which are trying to bypass and avoid the sanctions. And I think Central Asian governments needs to be very careful how they treat this kind of businesses. So because in the absence of strong safeguards, governance policies, and regulatory policies to sort of filter the sanctioned businesses, the Central Asian countries may end up in kind of accepting these businesses and being kind of hit by the secondary sanctions. And that is going to be very serious. So it is very important in this regard to develop and kind of implement the corporate governance, anti-corruption policies and filters, which would allow to prevent the sanctioned business of kind of finding harbor in Central Asia, and instead attract the positive and good businesses which are not hit by sanctions. For example, Uzbekistan is trying to kind of develop a kind of Silicon Valley and attract the non-sanctioned software developers and IT businesses from Russia and provide them a good kind of an attractive space to operate. The same happening in Armenia. So that could be a good example. Another big question and implication is how China is going to behave, because there is a popular saying that Central Asia is sandwiched between Russia and China. So whenever Russia is suffering, it creates a space for China to increase its already high influence. And that raises the questions of the debt sustainability, economic, political security, the influence of China. So again, need to be very careful. Again, the question of importance of the governance, anti-corruption, safeguards. And the final recommendation, as I already mentioned, it is time to go from reforms imitation to reforms implementation. It is important to create genuine, real opportunities, demonstrate political will and commitment to serious reforms, tackle corruption, state capture, create democratic opportunities for private sector and attract good foreign investments also from the West. And that could also happen as a result of improvements in the private sector, how the private sector operates, how the corporate governance is being implemented, integrity, anti-corruption, you name it. It has been on the agenda of the Central Asian governments for very long, and this crisis probably an opportunity to finally implement those critical reforms and explore the world beyond Russia and China, and kind of help the Central Asian economies to integrate in the global economic system. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sabir. You talked about the collective action at the national level. Is there any prospect of collective action at the regional level? For example, trying to foster regional supply chains, or maybe doing something collectively with the kind of this expertise on sanctions that we don't really have, right? What you were saying. So do you see any kind of promise in this direction or not?
I certainly see at the moment, unfortunately, it has been on the agenda, and there were various discussions and the initiatives especially from Kazakhstan and lately from Uzbekistan, to sort of drive intra-Central Asia regional cooperation, integration, restore the supply chains. It has been already done in the energy sector and the other supply chains, but it is not, unfortunately, that kind of fast and easy. I clearly see an opportunity especially for Uzbekistan, thanks to its central location, to play a key role in kind of integrating, bringing together Central Asia businesses, producers, governments, and kind of try to localize those supply chains of the critical goods and the energy, the food, pharmaceuticals, other supply chains. That would clearly help Central Asia to position itself as a stronger, competitive region with the rest of the world, and that is clearly a very good idea and the excellent plan. Unfortunately, it is not that kind of quickly developing and materializing, but I think it is obviously a very good proposal.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Karis. Karis, what's the situation with the millions of labor migrants, Central Asian labor migrants in Russia? What are they doing now? You think they will be moving back to the region or try to move out elsewhere? And so what's going on?
Sure. Thank you, Nargis, and thank you for this invitation. It's great to be able to kind of process through some of these dramatic issues together. This is the way that we kind of cope as scholars, because we're not immune to the emotional fallout of all of these really traumatic events. So this is a great opportunity, and thank you. So I want to make a couple of points about what we see now, both in relation to migration, the traditional patterns of migration, Central Asians going to Russia to work, but also immigration coming out of Russia, either by those Central Asian migrants or by Russians themselves. So, I mean, historically, when we look at migration patterns after kind of in the wake of economic crises in the past, certainly we see the biggest impact on remittances. So remittances really dipped sharply after the global financial crisis in 2008 and after the ruble crisis in 2014. And oftentimes when we talk about remittances, we focus on the changes in the portion of GDP made up by remittances coming into Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. But I think we should also pay attention to how outgoing remittances from Russia track along its overall GDP. Because if we look at remittances sent to CIS countries from Russia as a percentage of the Russian GDP, we certainly see the same trends. So there's a dip after 2008 and a dip after 2014, but I think it's a little bit less dramatic. And in fact, these trends recover more quickly than the overall remittances out of Russia, meaning to all destinations. And so how I interpret this is that despite, each time we have an economic crisis in Russia, there's all of these dire predictions that migrants are going to go home, they won't be able to work. But in reality, we've seen that they don't go home, that they do stay and work. They're able to send home less money, but they do continue to be a more or less stable foundation of the Russian economy. But I think what we're seeing now is different in a couple of ways. So one of the differences is that there's a great deal of information that migrants get through personal networks. And so what we see among migrants is there's a much more diverse information landscape than for Russian citizens. And this means that they are being exposed to the war in Ukraine without that layer of Russian media propaganda. And I think we also need to keep in mind that migrants aren't simply economic actors, these rational robots who are bent on making money absent other considerations, right? Migrants are embedded in social networks, and they're moral actors too. So at the popular level, amongst Central Asian citizens, even if it's not reflected in government policy, there really is a great deal of social solidarity of the colonized, meaning Central Asians understand this very aggressively marginalized position of Ukraine. And so I think that affects their decision making, not for everybody, but certainly I think it's a factor that hasn't been present before. Another factor that makes things maybe a little bit different now in Russia is that there's new laws since the beginning of the year that have really required a lot of invasive and bureaucratically tedious medical checks. There's also been a number of really dire proposals to do things like ban foreigners altogether from working in order to save jobs for local workers in the wake of the sanctions, to criminalize fictitious marriages and things like this. The legal environment for migrants is wearying at best. And so, I mean, in some ways, migrants can get tired of this and just decide to go home. In terms of technology and the ability to send money home, which is a big reason why migrants go to Russia in the first place, there's a number of money transfer options that have closed because of sanctions related to Russian banks, to SWIFT, to Visa and MasterCard. So far, there still are options that exist, but it really narrows the space of how migrants can send money home. And the sanctions make this really unpredictable going forward. So, for example, Western Union is supposed to be pulling out in the next couple of days. So getting money home will be a bigger problem than ever before. Even for those migrants that want to leave, there is a problem with being able to physically get home. In part, this is because the land borders with Kazakhstan are still closed due to COVID regulations. So you have to have exceptional special circumstances in order to use the land borders. And also in part because the number of flights has really dramatically decreased because Russian airlines are no longer flying internationally. Kazakhstani airlines have suspended many flights because of insurance reasons. So those are kind of drying up the availability of seats on airplanes. But also we have the fact that many of those seats that are remaining are being bought by Russians that are fleeing the country. And this is the other kind of migration pattern that I think warrants a couple of words. So in the past days, we've seen an estimated tens of thousands of Russians leaving and heading south into Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. I mean, there's certain advantages to going to Eurasian Economic Union countries because they can work as long as they have a contract with an employer. So this, in some ways, would make it easier to integrate. But I think that this movement is provoking a lot of fears. It's provoking a lot of fears that are more kind of maybe presumptive rather than kind of factual, but this rhetoric and this fear I think really matters. And I think there's three dimensions of this movement of Russians back into Central Asia that I think are worth watching and might complicate, kind of things going forward. The first is there's a colonial dimension, there's a security dimension, and there's a sort of truth and solidarity dimension. So the colonial dimension is that there's this fear that if Russians come to Central Asia, they are going to come with expectations of being treated as superior. I'm not sure that they expect that, but that is the fear that we hear from people. And there's absolutely no doubt that Russia has a whiteness problem, right? The idea that being Slavic is the norm and that being non-Slavic is other. And this is something that's rarely explicitly deconstructed among the population. So this is something that we're certainly watching going forward. It's much more felt and seen by populations of Central Asia. So there's this joke in going around in the internet saying, oh, well, if Russians want to come to Tashkent, then I suggest reciprocity. So mandatory exams for knowing Uzbek language, history, passing mandatory medical exams, creating migration centers with long lines, and harassing migrants, on the streets. So there, of course, this seems absurd, but this is what comes with a sort of whiteness problem. The idea that these are somehow habitual ways of dealing with populations that are outsiders or that are others. For Kazakhstan specifically, there's also a security dimension. So Kazakhstan sees itself in the very same precarious position that Ukraine is in. So are we next? being invaded by Russia. Kazakhstan feels this very strongly. And the more kind of Russian population that comes into Kazakhstan, the more this could potentially, the more it creates these fears, right, that Russia will have a pretense to come in and save the ethnic Russian population or the Russian-speaking population or what have you. So Kazakhstanis are very sensitized to recent comments by Zyuganov, talking about xenophobia in the wake of the January events, statements by Putin historically about, Kazakhstan not being sovereign. There's been recent articles about xenophobia and things like this. So these are very sort of sensitive issues that people are paying attention to. But on my last dimension is perhaps a more positive dimension. That's the truth and solidarity dimension. And that is that there's not uniformly, but there are large populations in Central Asia that are really committed to the truth about Ukraine and are working to tell the truth to relatives who watch mostly Russian media or are subjects of the Russian propaganda. And I do think that this could potentially create solidarity with those Russians that are coming to Central Asia because they're coming to Central Asia because they're protesting the war. And so I think that this could be a potential link for solidarity. So in short, the movement of Russians to Central Asia is really entangled in a lot of fears, histories, hierarchies, as is the movement of Central Asians up into Russia traditionally. I do think that they will have to kind of keep our eyes on both of these situations, not necessarily because they're volatile. I don't necessarily think that they're dangerous, especially the Russians coming to Central Asia, but it is really theoretically invigorating. I mean, we don't really see movements like this very often. So it's not colonialism, it's not reverse colonialism, it's not kind of recolonialization. I'm not really sure where it fits theoretically. And so I think that is something that's really interesting to watch. It's an opportunity for research, of course, not without understanding that these are also traumatic situations for the people that are involved. So I'll leave it there and be happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Karis. Really fascinating. So what's your sense? Are they can we see the return of Central Asian migrants back to Central Asia, or they will be rather considering other options?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there have been other options for Central Asian migrants for a long time, but not in the same volume and not at the same pace as going to Russia. It's just easy to go to Russia because the network's already established. There's just, things, it's a known quantity, right? Otherwise going to South Korea or going to Turkey, it just comes with a lot more uncertainty, a lot more questions. So certainly there will be more motivation to go to alternative destinations. I think it really depends on, I mean, everybody says this, every talk that we go to that says exactly this thing. We just have to see what happens in the next, in the coming months and years, to see how far Putin is really going to go in shutting Russian down and closing it to the outside world. And if he really succeeds in kind of recreating this very dark Soviet place, I think we will see Central Asians choosing other options, because I think this is just a much darker time in Russia than I've ever seen before in all of my time of watching it.
Indeed. Okay, Bradley, can I move to you and please moderate the Q&A?
Sure, yeah, and thanks a lot to all our speakers for their great presentations. I'll open up the floor to questions. So if you have any questions, please just submit them in the question Q&A box, and I'll just go through them, and I'll just address them openly. So anyone that wants to jump in, feel free to. I guess we'll start with George Kroll. He asks, how does the Russian sanctions situation affect the attractiveness of Central Asian economies for the European Union, the United States, and Asian investors, as well as the prospects for global energy companies already invested or contemplating doing business in Central Asia? How will their decision calculus be impacted? Sure, Max.
If I may, I'll take at least part of the question. I think in the short-term future, we're likely to see a lot of suspensions of investment, just given the level of uncertainty. As I was saying earlier, I do think, in most situations, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan can weather the fiscal crisis in Russia, although simply given, how deep it's going to be, that remains to be unseen, and the new, effective dependency of the Kazakh government on the Russian government raises serious questions there as well. Uzbekistan, simply because of its progress over the last 5 years and coming from a relatively low base, I think will be the first of them to, if markets calm and we don't end up in a global recession, to be seen as attractive again. Turkmenistan has long been a place of very poor prospects for foreign firms, in particular Western ones. There's only a handful that really operate regularly, although there are a number of Japanese and South Korean firms. But Western firms are unlikely there. The political uncertainty there, I think, will make that even more uncertain going forward as well. And I don't expect Turkmenistan to be getting foreign investment in one way or another.
Okay, I guess we'll take another question. Janya Adolbeck has asked about logistics and the future of the Belt and Road in particular, and how trade between Europe and Asia may be impacted by the sanctions on Russia.
I can try to answer this question. Clearly, the whole value proposition of Belt and Road initially was to kind of cut the distance and explore and shift from the maritime supply chains to land supply chains using the railways and other connections, transportation links going through Russia. That would shorten the time and distance and the costs of the Chinese the imports from exports from China to Europe, and very severe disruptions of transportation links in especially in Russia, going through Ukraine, Belarus, then to Europe, that is going to be clearly affected in negative terms. So in the least worst scenario, they probably increase the costs and the risks of transportation and logistical supplies. But in the worst case scenario, I think China would need to switch back to maritime supply chains, which would be much longer and more expensive. And let us bear in mind that the whole kind of global supply chain businesses are already severely affected by the shortage of cargoes, ships, trains, following the COVID crisis and the previous kind of disruptions. And it is going to get worse. Going to be more expensive. It would definitely amplify the inflation trend on the global markets, also in Central Asia. The Central Asia being a sort of a transit hub for the BRI projects, and they benefited clearly from the investments, from the transit transit revenues, and also some of the shipments were kind of available to Central Asia as well. So it is also going to affect Central Asia economically in terms of availability of critical Chinese imports.
One other quick thought on that. I don't see the Belt and Road as a program that's ever really had Russia at its core. In many ways, it's been about going around Russia more than linking China through Central Asia and then on to Russia. Of course, the final status of Ukraine has real impacts on the potential Western linkage of there. China has invested in Ukraine quite significantly as well. But one country that will be even more important for at least the potential land-based routes of this, and simply the strategic makeup of it, both with regards to the immediate impacts in Ukraine, but with Central Asia over the long term, is Turkey, and China's relations with Turkey, where it has been a quite substantial investor, including in a lot of infrastructure. And I'm not a China specialist, I'm not a Turkey specialist by any means. But at least when it comes to these policy conversations that we're having, as at least in my case, as Westerners, I've been surprised by how little attention we've been paying to where Turkey's role fits in it. And I think it behooves Western governments and policymakers to consider it more with regards to Central Asia, as well as with regards to the Ukraine conflict.
We have another question here from Dan Arthur, which relates to migration. It was discussed by Dr. Schenk that migrants may be looking for other options as the Russian market declines, both in terms of, for labor, but also possibly education as well. Where do you see their future options, and how may that change over the short to medium term?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of student migration, we do see a lot of migration coming out of Central Asia going into Russia. That's been a really robust trend. But we do see that there are other options, right? I mean, Russia is obviously a Russian-speaking sort of educational environment, but South Korea is a great option. Going into Europe, Turkey, I think these are all viable options. And Japan, these are all really well-traveled routes for student migration, at least. And I think that more and more they can be routes for economic migration as well. So they're not as well traveled. Also some Central Asian migrants, we've seen some go to the United Arab Emirates. That's not as kind of obviously not as democratic of a place, though neither is Russia. So this is, maybe not as ideal of a choice, but I do think that there are other options. I'm not sure how much those economies can absorb the sheer number of migrants that the Russian economy has absorbed. And so really this all comes down to the viability of Russia's economy. If there's enough if there remains enough economic activity to support this lower niche of the labor market, then migrants will still go to Russia, even if they earn less. But if that dries up for whatever reason, then it'll be really hard for them for everybody to find jobs in alternate destinations.
Did anyone else want to add to that?
If I may, yeah, I just wanted to add that the key question for diversification of migration flows to other labor markets is obviously the skills and competitiveness of Central Asia labor. I think the talks about diversification of migration flows were being for long on the agenda of the governments in Central Asia, but the reality is that Central Asian migrants, they occupy the lowest niche in Russian labor markets, and they are competitive there because of the shortage and lack of basic skills and some knowledge of Russian language. So in order for Central Asian migrants to be kind of seriously competitive on other markets of the Middle East, South Korea, there needs to be a serious conversation and investments into the skills development, the language skills, basic knowledge, legal skills of the migrants, and expanding connectivity of Central Asia with the rest of the world. Air connectivity, transport connectivity. So in the absence of this, it will be kind of piecemeal approach and a little bit in South Korea, a little bit kind of in Turkey, but it won't help to diversify millions of Central Asian migrants and help them to find different destinations.
Thanks for that. And we have another question from Mamaka Tsiriteli. She asked about the prospect of companies moving to Uzbekistan for software, IT companies, and other companies in the tech sector. Is the local human capital ready for employment in that sector, and how will it adapt?
Yeah, I might try to answer this question as well. The prospects are there. The prospects, sorry, they are there, but the enabling environment and opportunities, they obviously, and the local skills, they are lagging. The discussions just started. I think if you ask me whether there is a kind of more prospects in other parts of the region, I think the Armenia would be the best answer. They were working for pretty long to develop the local the IT businesses, software developers, startups, high-tech venture capital. This process only starts in Central Asia. The whole enabling environment for digital economy in Central Asia is pretty weak. The connectivity, regulatory barriers still in place. Central Asians need to do a serious work in kind of creating more better enabling environment for the digital economy, digital governance that would clearly help Russian companies to find a more attractive niche, because it's not just an issue of creating a Silicon Valley or some sort of business incubator to resettle in Tashkent, but there needs to be fast-speed internet, the cybersecurity, and the skills, supporting skills in the IT supply chain from the local staff and the local companies.
Great. And Hans Holjacker asks, to what extent will the SWIFT embargo for Russian banks affect Central Asian trade because of payment difficulties? Matt, would you like to tackle that one?
Yes, I can tackle this as well. Sorry,
whoever would like to.
I think the SWIFT embargo are going to hit Central Asian countries to some extent, but not that dramatically. Most of the businesses, the kind of using also alternative routes such as Union Pay, and the SWIFT embargo is largely affecting Russian banks. So the transactions and the financial transactions with the non-sanctioned businesses and the outside of the SWIFT channels, traditional sort of banking channels, which are working for the corresponding banks, and then kind of helping the Central Asian businesses to pay for the cargoes and goods and shipments in Russia. They are not the only channel for the Central Asian businesses. Lots of businesses, they operate using the kind of fast money transfer systems, and which are not still yet affected. They're also using the Union Pay and other kind of outside of the Visa, the kind of channels of transactions. And plus lots of businesses, they are basically operate in alternative financing system and channels of transactions outside of the SWIFT and legal banking transactions.
If I may, just two other thoughts on that. I agree that SWIFT in itself isn't hugely impactful. The sanctioning of the Russian central bank is for Russia far more significant, and for Central Asia as well. The Central Asian countries don't hold significant amounts of reserves in rubles, but there will be some assets that are affected. One sort of potential area for impact is gold sales, in particular from Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. The Russian central bank is a major purchaser. The gold market is liquid enough that I think they'll be able to find alternative destinations and won't engage in sales to the Russian central bank. But of course, there has been some talk of Russia looking to use its gold as a tool to evade sanctions that could cause even more headaches for the region. I don't see that as that likely, because they'd simply have to flood the gold market to do so, and making the level of physical deliveries needed is impossible, or likely to be impossible. And then finally, I think for Central Asia, in terms of its relationship with the Russian banking sector overall, it is fairly insulated in most places, but in Kazakhstan, there's the potential for impacts. The Kazakh banking sector has only, really begun to somewhat recover lately, and then still has some issues, including the level of political control there. And then finally, bringing back to the migrant point, but tying into this one area of concern is there is the potential for governments in the region that control their effective exchange rates to effectively seek to create disparity between the market rates between the ruble available at home and that are available abroad, and in which case they can basically skim off the top of migrant workers' remittances. And we saw the Tajik government pull some shenanigans with its remittances structure in 2019, now that effectively was done to help shore up its balance sheet, but didn't really help Tajiks, and resulted in a lot of delays to remittances for a little while, and again was just done out of the government's benefit. So that's an area to watch as well. I haven't seen any immediate evidence of that, though there have been some reports of unfair market rates in Uzbekistan. That the central bank there has at least put out a statement telling banks not to do that. But yeah, that's one to watch, particularly in the thinly traded currencies of the region.
We have a question here from Andrew Coogans. He says he's seen reports about Russians who have left to relocate to Georgia. They've been subject to Russophobic attacks. Landlords have been refusing to rent to them, etc. Can we anticipate a similar trend in Central Asia?
I can take this one. I really hope not. I think that would be really the worst case scenario. I hope that that's not true. because I think that would create a lot of backlash politically in Russia as well. I don't see any reason to expect that, I mean, like I said, that there's fears among the Central Asian populations about these, but it's not hatred. So I don't think that we'll see a similar sort of, I mean, that's speculation, right? I hope that we won't see that. I don't think that there's a lot of reason to expect that.
Great. I guess a broader question that could be addressed to everyone would be thinking about sanctions design at the moment. Should policymakers be thinking ways that can mitigate some of the effects of spillover into dependent regions such as Central Asia, and how might they alleviate some of those collateral effects?
Yeah, I may start, if okay with the rest of the experts. As already mentioned, there are anti-crisis action plans in development by all Central Asian countries, and the mitigation measures, they're not new. They would allow for some kind of temporary mitigation of shocks through fiscal and monetary tightening measures. Central Asian countries can kind of ring fence some of the expenditures to maintain sustainability of basic revenues and expenses, keep the stable inflation, and sort of tighten the monetary regulations to maintain stability of exchange rate. But the reserves are not kind of infinite. They already depleted by the COVID crisis, and obviously Central Asian countries, especially the poorest one, such as Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan Republic, they are in a pretty dire financial shape. The level of resources is low, revenues are sort of also not quite strong. The situation probably a little bit better in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but Kazakhstan already sold almost $500 million of the reserves to maintain the stability of the tenge. So the big question is actually for us all to think is that to what extent these temporary macroeconomic measures would help to maintain stability in the long term. My take, it's nearly impossible. So it is essential to think about the new economic model and the key systemic reforms. I know it's not easy and it's a long-term agenda, but the countries need to start from something. Probably the immediate measures which comes in mind is trying to localize the critical supply chains, build some kind of material reserves of food, stock of the food, energy, kind of support markets and businesses, alleviate the pressure on the private sector suppliers and the companies in terms of excessive regulation, taxation, licensing, reduce the tax pressure and the administrative burden. That way the markets would themselves try to diversify and find alternative routes. That's probably what comes in mind. But in the long term, again, the key answer is the reforms.
Can
I would say, yeah. I would certainly endorse that. I think localization in the region does run a risk of protection, but if Central Asia's geographic boundaries make it very difficult for it to just integrate into the world economy, even if that's what the countries want. Uzbekistan has experienced that as part of its capital markets opening, but of course, being a doubly landlocked country in Central Asia means that progress is slower than one would hope for. I think the political ramifications of Russia's actions are really only beginning to be felt. I am, to be frank, most negative on matters there immediately with regards to Kazakhstan, because I don't know if the government has the alternative, the political ability in the current environment to pursue reforms in a way that isn't entirely managed by Russia, or to seek alternative partnerships. And that a real question that I think needs to be asked in Western policy making towards it is that if we are going to try to partner with some of these states more, or, for example, I think it is extremely likely that Tajikistan will need some kind of IMF, new IMF program or other major assistance. But as we are talking about targeting Russian kleptocracy, we're doing that now because they're on the opposite side of a almost proxy war. But kleptocracy in our allies isn't something that we should tolerate either, and it can certainly be traced to impoverishing Ukraine a lot, and has certainly impoverished a lot of countries in the Central Asian region as well. But there's no straightforward answer. Targeting that in a serious way will cause economic pain in the region as well. But I do think it's time for, I know the US, for example, just released its Central Asia strategy belatedly in 2020. It was technically dated from 2019 and said nothing new. I think it's time for, all of Europe, all of the West, Europe, the United States, to be looking at, a whole new approach to Central Asia. And in particular, as I mentioned, Turkey, one other area that'll be economically important and can be politically important as well are the East Asian countries that have substantial ties, Korea and Japan as well. So I hope that this is not the last time that we have this conversation, but certainly the beginning of only many of these conversations.
Our time is coming to an end, so let me just ask one very short question to you, Max. How about Iran? You mentioned Turkey, you mentioned East Asia. What about Iran? Is it then kind of other possibilities there?
Sure, that's one of the things that I was thinking about with the political ramifications of this crisis are only beginning to play out, and how they recast the geopolitics is something I would be foolish to try to predict definitely, but perhaps the bit of social media content that surprised me the most so far out of all of this was a few days after the invasion began, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former hardline Iranian president, tweeting out, Slava Ukraini, was not something I would have expected. Iran does, and the potential lifting of sanctions has potential implications for the Belt and Road as well. And including for India's positioning in the region because of its development of the Chabahar port, connecting through Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan has made some talks about boosting trade there, but the figures, which aren't really reliable anyway, don't show the same kind of ridiculous growth that they normally do when Turkmenistan talks about these kind of things. And then, of course, there's still border closures with Uzbekistan as well. Iran also hasn't ratified the Caspian Sea Treaty, which was sort of one of the major political developments in the region quite a while before. I'm not an Iran expert. I won't say a prediction on what's going to happen with the Iran deal or not. Personally, I've been an advocate for essentially switching Western posture from Saudi Arabia to Iran pretty much since I was a child. But Iran has the potential there, but in terms of being able to be a major player or salvage or offer an alternative, given the incredibly insular nature of the Turkmen regime and its highly closed economy, even if things go as swimmingly as one could hope for with Iranian-Western relations, I don't think it will offer as much potential as, say, Turkey can, or necessarily even those East Asian states that I spoke about.
Thank you very much. Well, Victoria Nuland recently had a congressional hearing, and she was asked about Central Asia, and she said something along the lines that we'll be supporting the diversification of political and economic relations of Central Asian states. So, I mean, okay, big questions, how and, in what direction. So, okay, with that, we are on the hour, and but let me give a minute to Sobir because he has a very important remark before we close this session.
Yeah, just something came to my mind. That's your first question, Nargis, how we can kind of help to localize the domestic supply chains and develop local competitive economy in Central Asia. And here I see an opportunity. I had a paper recently published for the Kyrgyz Institute on the importance of Fergana Valley as a domestic driver of growth. And I think in the global competitiveness theory, every region should be competitive with something else. That could be either IT, tourism, agriculture. And we all know that Central Asia is known as a hub for organic agriculture, tourism, and the excellent fresh and organic products. That means that the Fergana Valley could be kind of piloted as a region where the barriers to trade, investments, and flow of goods, value chains could be removed, and the Central Asian governments could realize that the valley could become an important engine of growth, prosperity, and development for Central Asia. That would help to solve food security issues, that would help to create jobs, employ migrants. It's highly populated, densely populated region, very poor region, but also full of amazing opportunities. Could be hub for developing tourism. That's again raises the question that the government just needs to create an enabling environment for the private sector, SMEs, entrepreneurs, which are very innovative, amazing, especially in Uzbekistan, to let them do the job and develop the businesses and create opportunities. So clearly Fergana Valley is a good hotspot for potential opportunities to localize the growth and prosperity in Central Asia.
I would endorse that completely. And for any policymakers who are listening, I think that's one area where the West could actually potentially be helpful and reduce the risk of conflicts in the region itself, which have sparked up occasionally in recent years.
Yeah, well, I would wholeheartedly endorse that as well. So let me close this session and thank our wonderful panelists. I think we all have learned a lot, and thank you, the audiences, for tuning in, and my co-moderator, Bradley Jardine, and our partner in crime, the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs, and my colleagues here at the Davis Center, Chris Martin and Laura Sargent, for making this event possible. We will have more discussions. Clearly, the changes, the shifts are just of such big magnitude. And we will try to have a discussion on Turkey and Iran in Central Asia in the near future. So please follow our announcements and tune in to our future events. Thank you very much. Have a nice day and night.
Thank you for having us.